Hello everyone, and welcome again to A Shortstop with a Shortstop. I appreciate everybody being here and watching, and continue to hope that you learn and are able to apply some of the things that we're studying to your lives. Today we're going to talk a little bit about worship. When I played baseball, I used to go into a lot of different cities: New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Montreal, Atlanta, Houston, St. Louis, just to name a few. But every once in a while I would be signing autographs for people outside the stadium or something of that nature, and I'd look and there would be a guy with a tattoo of one of the players that were playing at that time on his arm or on his chest or something of that nature. And I've actually had people tell me that they worship that player, and they would have monuments built in their home of this player, or sometimes it would just be the team that they would worship. It may be in football, it may be in basketball or something of that nature, but that is not the worship that the Bible talks about. We're not to worship any man, because in Acts chapter 10 verses 25 and 26, Peter was coming to Cornelius and was going to teach him about Jesus Christ. But when Peter arrived where Cornelius was at, Cornelius fell down at Peter's feet and worshiped him. But Peter immediately said, "Hey, Cornelius, you get up, because I'm just a man." We, as New Testament Christians, do not worship men. We worship God. What is worship? It's an action motivated from the heart of reverence for the divine, with the knowledge of who He is and what He has done for us. And if we think about it, we have a God that tells us in John 3:16 that He so loved us that He sent His only begotten Son. And what did His only begotten Son do? He died for each and every single one of us. And that is where our worship is to be given. And in the New Testament, there are three different types of worship. If we look at Matthew chapter 15, verse 9, it says this: "But in vain do they worship me, teaching the doctrines and the precepts of men." Now, vain worship is something that is worthless, something that is useless, and it's something that we don't want to do, because most of the time it's some type of man-made doctrine that has fallen in, and people are accepting, and that's what we don't want. We don't want to do any type of vain worships. Because if we look in Revelation chapter 22, verses 18 and 19, it tells us not to add to or subtract from. And that's talking about the Word of God or the Bible. And if we add something to worship or take something away from worship, all it is vain. And therefore it would be useless. And the worst thing about it is God doesn't approve of it. The second type of worship is ignorant worship. If we look in Acts chapter 17, verses 23 through 31, the Apostle Paul is on Mars Hill, and he's in the city of Athens in Greece. And I was fortunate that I've been to Greece. I've been to Athens. I've stood on Mars Hill, the exact same place where the Apostle Paul was. And you could look down and see the Acropolis, and it is a huge, maybe a couple of miles long, of what we would say here in the United States, a flea market. But they had all kinds of gods lined up, and you could go down there and purchase them. You can even do that today. But I stood on Mars Hill, and right behind me was the Parthenon, about 200 yards back, and it's huge. They'd built one to the goddess Diana, and they'd built one to the god Zeus. And I mean, these were huge structures, huge buildings, and they built them to false gods, and they worshiped them. But Paul, in the sermon that he preached to those men in Athens, he preached to them about an unknown God. And he told them that they worshiped that God in ignorance. And that's the second type of worship that is mentioned in the New Testament, ignorant worship. We do not want to worship anything in ignorance because God will not approve of that also. And the third type of worship is true worship. And we find that in John chapter 4, verses 21 through 24. And I want to read that to you. And it says, Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither the mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But for an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." This is the type of worship that we want to be involved in, is to worship our God in spirit and in truth. Now, what the spirit part of it is with the right attitude, having a attitude of awe of who God is and what he does for us. And in truth is looking at the New Testament and seeing what he tells us to do in our worship service. And if we do that, then we are worshiping him in spirit and in truth. And that's the type of worship that we want to be involved in all the time, because we don't want to add to, we don't want to subtract from. We don't want to ignorantly worship him, and we don't want to worship him in vain. But we want to have true worship. And the true worship is in spirit and in truth, with the right attitude and with the truth that comes from the New Testament. We also need to understand that there are three elements of true worship. One, that's the right object. And who is the right object? And that would be God, our Creator. We have to have a type of worship which we endeavor to become as much like God as we can, as far as the attitude that he has, the love that he projects, the humility and the humbleness that he wants us to have. But we also need to have the right attitude. That's called in spirit. We need to be sincere in our true worship with respect and awe unto our Creator, and have fellowship one with another. And again, we need to do it the right way, and that's in truth, by his instructions, not by commands or ideas of men. Because why? Because we worship God, and he wants us to do it in the right way. Again, thank you for being with a shortstop.